An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
A very good day to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ryan Bell, and I'm your host. This is the 75th episode of Life After God. As most of you know, I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and was a pastor in the church for 19 years. I went to Seventh-day Adventist elementary schools, colleges, and the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary for my Master of Divinity degree. For decades, the Adventist Church has fought off its identification as a cult. I was frequently confused in the minds of the general public as a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness throughout the years of my ministry. These are the other American cults that emerged in the United States in the 19th century. Adventists and the Witnesses actually share some common history as well, as you'll hear in just a few minutes. My guest today is probably the most famous contemporary ex-Jehovah's Witness and has been instrumental through his writing and his YouTube channel for helping hundreds of people find freedom. Before I tell you more about him, a few quick updates about Life After God. This new season of the podcast has been running steadily since January 1st this year. My commitment at that time was to do 2 episodes a month, roughly every other week. And since January 1, for the past almost 5 months, I've produced 14 episodes, or an average of 2.8 episodes per month, which have been downloaded over 36,750 times. We're not breaking any records, but I'm so thrilled and honored that you're a part of this community. Your participation means so much to me, whether it's just listening whenever you get the chance or being a member and supporting the show financially. And I just wanted to take a moment and thank you so much for being here and being a regular listener and downloading the show and writing to me when you have the impulse to do that, which of course I welcome at any time. Anyone that wants to reach out and drop me a line, you can email me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org. If you appreciate this podcast, there are a number of ways that you can support it, most of which are free. You can subscribe to the show using your favorite podcasting app so you don't miss an episode. You can go to iTunes and write us a review, a glowing review, of course. This actually helps other people find us. I'm not sure how it works, but the experts that I read tell me that when people write reviews and rate the show on iTunes, it puts it on people's radar in a different way. So I'd love it if you would go and leave us a review. You can tell a friend about Life After God or post about it on your social media. You can sign up for our newsletter and subscribe to our social media. You can find the newsletter and links to all of our social media accounts on the website, lifeaftergod.org. And finally, you can support us financially. This podcast is one of the most rewarding things I do, and I'm committed to keeping it free so as many people as possible can hear it. But it isn't free to produce. And if you'd like to help keep the show going with a regular monthly contribution, I'd invite you to visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. For a limited time, if you join as a member, which is just $5 per month, approximately the cost of a latte per month, you will receive a limited edition Life After God magnet that I just had made. If you're already a member, you'll be happy to know that your magnet is already on its way to your address. For the next 30 people who join, you will receive this beautiful magnet as a token of my appreciation. In all of these ways, you can help me get the word out to a wider audience and help the growing number of people who are just starting their journey away from faith and religion into the unknown. So please become a member today. Just visit patreon.com/lifeaftergod and join. My guest today is Lloyd Evans. Lloyd is the founder and senior editor of jwsurvey.org, a website that promotes free thought among Jehovah's Witnesses. He is also author of The Reluctant Apostate, a book that chronicles his experience growing up as a JW and his journey to freedom from Watchtower indoctrination. His John Cedars YouTube channel, which has nearly 50,000 subscribers, hosts a range of videos aimed at dissecting the various teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as new developments in the religion. Lloyd was quoted in the March 22 Atlantic article entitled "A Secret Database of Child Abuse. A former Jehovah's Witness is using stolen documents to expose allegations that the religion kept hidden for decades." The former Jehovah's Witness referred to in the sub-headline is Mark O'Donnell, not Lloyd Evans, but it was through Lloyd's YouTube videos that Mark O'Donnell found his way to freedom. Lloyd Evans, welcome to the Life After God podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a little overdue. I know we've been chatting off and on over the last few years, and it's just a real privilege to talk to you now. And it came about in my mind again, or the impulse to contact you came about for me again because I saw the article in the Atlantic recently about the database of child molesters from the Jehovah's Witness Church. So I want to definitely talk to you about that because I know you're referenced in there as well as a source.
Sure. No, that was a very good piece. It took a year for Douglas Quenquer to put that piece together. He did an awful lot of research and drew together a lot of information, including some very powerful, compelling stories. So I was very pleased that that story was published.
So before we get into that, though, I know quite a few of my listeners will be familiar with you, especially those that come from a Jehovah's Witness background. You've been really instrumental in so many people's lives in helping them find freedom. But for those that aren't ex-JWs, it's a little bit of a mystery, perhaps. Some of these, like Seventh-day Adventism is for me. People are like, yeah, I think I've heard of that. Probably more people are familiar with the Jehovah's Witness than are familiar with the Adventists for some reason. But maybe you could just give us a little of your background. Like, where did you grow up, and what was your experience of? Did you grow up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and what was that like for you as a young kid?
Sure. So as you can probably tell, I'm British. So I grew up in northern England, not far from Manchester. In fact, when you fly into Manchester Airport, you're only 10 minutes away from the family home where I grew up. I have flown into that airport. Well, there you go. So yeah, it was very, very convenient for taking holidays abroad. But yeah, it was a very, very devout upbringing that I had. Both of my parents were witnesses. On my dad's side, it went back as far as his parents joining, or at least his mother joining. So they took it very, very seriously. And although I had friends at school, the only ones I was really allowed to hang out with and spend lots of time with were other Jehovah's Witnesses. And yeah, it had a big impact on me, so that by the time I was sort of in my teens, I was almost convinced that I wanted to devote my career to the religion. But then I began having doubts at around the age of 19 or 20. These were mostly to do with the theology and with various interpretations of prophecy that just weren't logically sound. And so I started waking up, but then when I was 21, my mother died, and this had the effect of plunging me sort of deeper into the religion, because as a Jehovah's Witness, you're told, well, if you want to see your dead loved ones again, you need to be as close as possible to the organization, because that's the only guarantee you have of seeing them in the resurrection. And so I again threw myself into my religion, and I went through what's called the Ministerial Training School, which is a 2-month course designed to really train young men into kind of becoming people who can be used by the organization in a variety of ways. And not long after doing that school, I was appointed an elder. But then a year later, for a variety of reasons, I ended up moving to Croatia, and I was warned at the time, this is going to have the effect, Lloyd, of weakening you spiritually, because you're not there's going to be a period where you don't know the language, and so you'll find it difficult to keep your spirituality strong. And I dismissed all this. And I said, no, I'll be fine. I'll learn the language and everything's going to be great. But that's exactly what ended up happening within just a few months of moving to Croatia. I found it was almost like being unplugged, like the scene from The Matrix where they pulled the jack out of the back of someone's head. It was like that. It was just this very, very conscious feeling of, okay, I'm in a religion and I'm pretty sure I don't believe it anymore. And yeah, so that thus began my journey into apostasy, which kind of had various stages to it, but to cut a long story short, I'm now a full-time activist, YouTuber, writer, done a bit of stuff with documentaries and television shows. So yeah, that's where I am now.
That's fascinating. When you said that your faith took a turn after your mother died, I thought you were going to say that pushed you further away from the church, which sometimes experiences like that do. And in your case, it pulled you in. And I don't have any empirical data to suggest one way or the other, which is more common an experience. But in my brief experience of talking to people who have left a very strong religious upbringing, those types of traumas can go either way. It seems to me. Have you had that experience?
Definitely. And I actually had people. Well, it's a life-altering thing, and I had people saying to me, like fellow believers in my congregation, saying, "Oh, are you angry at God?"
Right.
And I'd say, well, why should I be angry at God? He's the only one who's giving me the opportunity to see her again. And that was my logic. It was like, well, yes, it's tragic what's happened, but wouldn't you know, I've been lucky enough to be born into the only religion that gives me a shot at cheating my own death and seeing my loved ones again who've died. So
what are the chances?
Yeah, what are the chances of that? And obviously I look back and think, what a hopelessly naive attitude. But that was the attitude I had. And
sure.
And so I really, even though I had doubts, and I think that lots of Jehovah's Witnesses have doubts, if not like the vast majority, because I don't know whether you're familiar with the Book of Mormon musical, but there's a song that says "Turn it off," and that's what it's like when you're a witness as well. You are told it's called waiting on Jehovah. You've got to basically bury all of your doubts and reservations in hopes that in one way or the other they will sort themselves out. And obviously they don't go anywhere; they just fester. And so my reservations from when I was 20, flicking in horror through this book that just was all over the place in terms of logic. When I did finally move to Croatia, it was precisely those doubts that came back. And I thought, hang on a minute, maybe I was onto something there. And it turned out I was. So, yeah.
Was the move to Croatia, was it as your sort of mentors were warning you, was it the language and or was it more like the uprooting yourself from a safe community? Because I know Adventism has this type of very sheltered type of communities where I went to elementary school at an Adventist school, and then ordinarily I would have gone to an Adventist high school. I had some other things that happened in my life, but then I ended up going to an Adventist college. And then you graduate and you get a job at a hospital, which is in an Adventist community, and you go to the Adventist church. And so there's this sort of insulation from the problems that your faith might confront if you were outside of that community. Is that something like what happened to you?
Not necessarily. It was an eye-opener to see the way the religion is interpreted slightly differently, depending on which country you're in. It's almost like an alternate universe where everything's pretty much the same, apart from just one or two little things which tell you it's different. And that's what it was like in Croatia. So they just had a slightly different attitude. You could say an even more I don't know, fastidious, devout attitude almost. They were kind of taking things to extremes. But really, it was the language. It was the fact that, I mean, these meetings, I mean, when you're a witness, you go to the Kingdom Hall twice a week and sit through meetings that are just over 90 minutes long. Mm-hmm. And when you're going through that kind of ritual week in, week out, it is like you're on a treadmill, but you're also just receiving this constant flow of indoctrination. And so what happened was, when I moved to Croatia, it was like someone had literally turned the tap off. There I was, kind of stranded with my own thoughts rattling around in my head, and slowly coming to the realization, oh, good grief, I'm not actually a Jehovah's Witness, because you can't be a Jehovah's Witness unless you agree with every single thing that the governing body tells you, and I manifestly don't agree with all of it. So how do I rectify this issue?
That's fascinating. And I feel like part of my growing up experience in the Adventist church was similar. Like it was, as one of my theology professors in seminary said, a ball of wax, like it was, and you couldn't separate out. So for instance, growing up, and it's also a weird moral equivalence that happens in a person's development. So for me, I was not supposed to listen to rock music. I wasn't supposed to drink caffeinated beverages. I wasn't supposed to go to dances or watch movies, especially not in a movie theater. And this was a sin to do these things. And so was, I don't know, having sex outside of marriage, or and then on another level altogether, like killing someone or stealing something. And there was no sort of sense of moral nuance in my life. And so if you went to the movies, you were essentially committing the same kind of sin as a murderer. And it was at that point that a lot of my peers, much earlier than I did, said, well, if I'm, going to, drink a Coke, let alone a beer, then I may as well just leave the church because I've done, a horrible thing. I'm not an Adventist anymore. It must be difficult for the church, for the Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization, to maintain faithfulness on the part of their believers and their members if it's such a high bar of commitment. How do they manage that?
Well, you would think so, but the thing about Jehovah's Witnesses is that for all of the high bars that they set, they have people's minds in their hands. They have total control over people, and they manage it through basically through fear. So that if you are, especially if you're raised as a Jehovah's Witness and it's all you've ever known, you believe that the world around you is doomed to be destroyed very soon, as in imminently, by Armageddon. And you believe that if Armageddon were to come or to catch you off guard, you'd be one of the ones who dies. In fact, it's so serious that there was actually a video leaked of a governing body member named Tony Morris giving a speech to some witnesses in Trinidad in January 2018, and he's telling them all to look at their hands. And he's saying, now, as you look at your hands, do you maybe see some blood on them? Well, you might see blood on your hands if you're not regular enough in the preaching work, in warning people of what's to come.
Oh, wow.
It could be that you've not been preaching. It could be that you've not been out in the preaching work in weeks, in which case, what were his exact words? You're going to lose your life. So
wow.
That is the level. I mean, there's no shame to it at all. It's just blatant manipulation and fear-mongering. But that's the level of control that the governing body has over witnesses, so that even like in my situation where I'm realizing that the theology doesn't make logical, rational sense, the existential kind of fear of of losing your life if you're not a witness kind of takes priority over all of those other things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned some of the logical inconsistencies that began to plague you especially when you moved to Croatia, but probably harking back to those initial doubts in your late teens, early 20s. What's an example of one or two of those from the witnesses that really were maybe the most troubling for you?
It's interesting because I now have a whole different list. I look at the list that I wrote back then. I called it my 9 grievances, and there was some interesting stuff on there. Like I'd reached the conclusion that evolution was a fact, and that is heretical in terms of Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that evolution is a lie.
Right.
And so that was one thing that I was kind of carrying with me. And by the way, that's a big deal when you're a witness, because, for example, you'll be watching the latest David Attenborough documentary. There's one out now called Our Earth, I think it's called. Really good. Huh. And you'll be watching it, and David Attenborough will say something about evolution, and you'll be sat there on your sofa saying, well, I know better,
I have that exact experience from my childhood, watching like National Geographic or something with my family.
Yeah.
And it's just beautiful, and we're just enraptured with the whole thing. And then he says, the narrator, whoever says, 8 million years ago or 6 million years ago, and we'll all kind of look at each other and roll our eyes like, well, he doesn't know what we know. So, it was just the weird and just dismissal without any evidence or arguments in our favor. It was just, it would have been the Bible.
You literally think as a fundamentalist that you know better than scientists.
Right.
If scientists say one thing and your religion says another. So it was that sort of thing. There were also one or two like issues with prophecy, like this book that I'd had an issue with. It came out when I was 19, and it was about the book of Daniel. And I was very enthusiastically kind of leafing through it because I felt I was at an age where I could start to spread my wings and create my own identity in the congregation. And I wanted to kind of be well briefed on this new publication that had come out. So I was reading it kind of very optimistically, thinking, oh, this is new information and I want to be on top of it all. And you come to stuff that just, it's internally inconsistent. So, for example, in one prophecy mentioned or referred to in the book, it says that ancient Rome ends up becoming the Anglo-American world power. They refer to it as the Anglo-American world power for various prophetic reasons. And then in another interpretation of Bible prophecy, they say that ancient Rome becomes Nazi Germany through convoluted reasoning involving Charlemagne. And so you're thinking, well, why would God inspire the Bible writers to on one hand say this power becomes Anglo-America, and on the other hand say this power, ancient Rome, becomes the nemesis of Anglo-America? How does that make any rational sense? So I picked up on this when I was 19, but again, you're thinking, well, big picture, Lloyd, you'd better agree with this, right, or you're toast if Armageddon comes. So that's how you rationalize your way through it.
It's weird how our brains could say that these writers or these so-called scholars or church leaders could be so inconsistent and wrong about, say, that prophecy, but right about hell, or you know what I mean? So it never occurs to you in the beginning that, well, because they're obviously both of these prophecies can't be true at the same time, so it's probably wrong that maybe they're also wrong about the afterlife and all these other things that would sort of mitigate the fear of losing your eternal life. But no, it's just like this fear of eternal life lives, this fear of losing eternal life lives in a different place in our brains, in this very sort of primitive place, it seems to me, where it triggers our deepest anxieties and existential fears, and somehow logic doesn't touch it. I've talked to people in the Life After God community who have become atheists and who can rattle off the arguments against Christianity with the best of them and probably win a debate against an apologist, but they still live from time to time this existential fear invades their life, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this fear. It's wild.
Yeah, it stays with you. It really does. But another thing that witnesses have is what's called new light. So that they pluck verses from the Bible that refer to the light getting brighter, and they say, well, what this means is that our understanding of the Bible is getting more accurate as time progresses, because God is slowly guiding us to the fullest knowledge of the truth over time with incremental increases in light or understanding. And you never stop to think for a moment that what that actually means is that in the past, God's been giving wrong information to his followers, which actually makes God a liar. And you never think of it that way. Right. You just somehow manage to say, oh, okay, that makes total sense. And you go along with it.
Yeah, with some of my progressive Adventist friends that I was traveling with at the time, and many of whom are still friends of mine, I sometimes will ask them, what is more likely, that God had the right attitude toward gays and lesbians and transgender people all along, and we're just now finally interpreting the Bible the right way and getting to the real truth that was always there all along? Or is it more likely that the Bible is just wrong about that and we're maturing morally as a human species? It seems so unlikely and actually contradictory to other claims about God, that God would, and it's just cruel, like that God would not give us that information. I mean, it's very clear that God is able to get very detailed about what's required, from how to wash your hands and when a person's unclean or clean, or exactly which animals should be sacrificed for which sins and when and how often. And it's very, very detailed information about how to be holy. And then the most general things like slavery, are very complicated for God. Can't quite get his head around, those big issues.
Oh, don't even get me started. I mean, I've made videos on some of the, because I'm actually now able to look at the Bible and think that this is a deeply immoral book if you follow its lessons and consider the kind of moral. Consider these pronouncements to be moral. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking there about the kind of clean, unclean laws, and one of those laws was that if you're a woman and you give birth to a baby girl, you're twice as unclean as if you were to give birth to a baby boy. Right. Well, how does that make any kind of sense? It only starts to make sense once you consider the possibility that it was written by men, right? Yeah. Living in a very backward time.
Literally men. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's remarkable. And even if you do what many Christians do, and say, well, the Old Testament was, God was meeting them where they were, and so it was an imperfect representation of what was God's ideal, and now it's getting, better in the New Testament and so forth. There's still the same sorts of problems, and in fact, you would almost expect for Jesus, at least, to correct some of those mistakes, to deliberately say, you've heard that it's been said, if your child sins against you in the following way, you should stone them. But I'm saying to you, don't do that, and the kind of in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does that a little bit, but it's very in vague terms, and it seems like there's just so many opportunities for God to clarify God's self. Yeah. And it's just that God turns out to be at best a very poor communicator. If I were God and I wanted, I had this utopian vision of the world, and I wanted my people to come along and accept my vision of the world and start to live according to that vision, I would be doing everything possible to get the message across, So I don't know. It's just far too complicated.
No, I actually, when I was a JW, I used to cringe at some of the passages in the Old Testament, and I used to kind of reason my way through it, thinking, well, at least by the New Testament, things are normality is established, and things are a little bit more respectable. But again, you apply critical thinking to the New Testament. In my opinion, the New Testament is worse in some ways. Because, for example, you have Romans 9, where it basically describes predestination and says that God hated Esau while he was still in the womb.
Wow.
and makes humans, makes some people as vessels of wrath fit for destruction. In other words, he makes them evil so that he can destroy them. This is the kind of crazy stuff that went through the Apostle Paul's head. And he's writing it down there in Romans 9 in, again, God's supposedly inspired, infallible word, telling us that God actually makes us evil, so just so that he can get the thrill of destroying us. It's astonishing. How
did your ministry, if we can call it that, of helping people who were going through serious doubts and deconverting from the witnesses, how did that come about for you?
I never imagined doing this, frankly. For me, it all started when having realized more or less, the extent to which I'd been exploited and lied to. I thought, well, maybe there's something interesting to be gained from going online and interacting with other ex-JWs. And that was quite a terrifying prospect for me, because obviously I'd spent my entire life being told of how evil and selfish and greedy they are, apostates, that is. And, they're even described as mentally diseased depending on where you look in Watchtower publications. So it wasn't something I went into lightly, but there I found myself surrounded by people who were going through or had gone through exactly the same thing I was going through. And just through interacting with them, I realized, gosh, there's actually, a lot of scope here for activism and for making resources available. And the first resource that I wanted to make available was a survey, because I thought, wouldn't it be great? Because Jehovah's Witnesses don't really get a voice. They just have to agree with everything that they're told. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we could have like a survey so that even believing Jehovah's Witnesses could go on the survey and indicate what they really think about various teachings and policies. So that became jwsurvey.org, because another ex-witness reached out to me. I'd never heard of him before. We'd never met each other, and he said, "Do you want me to build you a website?" So I said, "Oh, go on then."
Yeah.
What have I got to lose?
Yeah.
And so that became jwsurvey.org, and the same friend, maybe a year or so later, said, "Oh, there's this big sex abuse story, Candace Conti, the court verdict. Watchtower's been fined millions, but I've noticed that there isn't really anything on YouTube covering it. What do you think about making a video? You're good at that kind of thing." So I made a video, and I was at that point not able to appear on camera because I was still technically a Jehovah's Witness. So I wrote a script and got someone else to read the script, and I did like a montage and that kind of thing. And that was really my first foray into YouTube.
How long ago was that?
That was 2012.
Okay, some time ago then.
Yeah. And then by November of 2013, my wife and I were expecting our first daughter. And that was actually the last push that we needed. I was already by that point ready to, exit completely and let my identity be seen and that kind of thing. But I was holding off because it wasn't the right time for my wife. Mm-hmm. But when we had Jessica on the way, we thought, no, we've got to make a clean break here, because if we remain in this religion, even if in name only, our relatives will consider it their duty to indoctrinate Jessica any opportunity they get. So we need to kind of draw the line in the sand and make a very clear statement that we're having no more of this. And so once that decision was made, I made my first ever kind of on-camera vlog, announcing the reasons why I was doing it, etc. And I don't know, it just felt natural to talk on camera about what my ideas were. And in a way, it was a very liberating kind of cathartic experience to do that. And again, that was November 2013. And obviously I've been at it ever since then, but probably the cathartic side of it has kind of dissipated somewhat. And I'm really doing it more now because, I've met people in person who've said very emotionally that something I've said or some kind of argument I've made has really impacted them in some way. And when you meet these people in person and you see in their faces how profoundly they've been affected by you just being in front of a camera for a few minutes, you think, gosh, I better do more of that,
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing to me, just as human beings, how sharing our stories unites us and brings us together around common themes. I mean, I think as, back to pre-literate societies, right? Like people sitting around a fire at night, eating and drinking and telling stories, and those stories become the bonds of a common community, a common humanity. And when people can hear their own experience, I mean, even me right now, listening to you for the last half an hour, I hear you saying things almost literally, like when you said new light, that the Jehovah's Witnesses have this concept of increasing light or new light. I mean, the Adventists have the exact same thing. And it just makes me feel, even though I'm 5 years on from my own deconversion, it makes me feel like this is, I feel connected to your story in a way that makes me feel less alone or less crazy, even though I'm fairly beyond feeling crazy about these sorts of things anymore. The only thing I feel crazy about anymore is that I ever was as committed to it as I was. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you next was, as you've been for the last 6 or 7 years telling your story and putting it out there for others to hear, and then getting feedback from those people who have heard your story and relate to it, what have been the common themes around what people need or what they long for or what they like, the types of resources that they need as they're coming to grips with their doubts and maybe their eventual unbelief?
Well, that's one of the most frustrating things because in my experience, people who escape a movement like Jehovah's Witnesses, where their thoughts are not their own for a sizable chunk of their lives, suddenly they've got to basically figure everything out from scratch, including how to do some fairly rudimentary interactions with people in their community who don't believe as they do, who they once believed were worthy of annihilation at any moment.
Wow, yeah.
And now they've got to start making friends with these people and developing a social circle. And so there's that issue. There's the whole. That's before we even talk about the kind of mental, emotional hang-ups from, I don't know, shunning a family member for decades, or believing that the world was going to end any moment. There's some tangible kind of fears and, I would say, demons lurking around in people's heads. And
sure,
I think all people, I think everyone who's been in that kind of movement has that to a greater or lesser degree. It's just a question of how you manage it. I think that it certainly in my case, it leaves you with a lot of anger. And you feel as though, you feel as though you've been abused. Your life has been altered, and you can never have back what was taken from you. And, having established the fact that you have this anger, it then becomes a question of, where do I direct this anger to, and how do I use this anger? And in my own case, I've figured out a way of using my anger, trying to turn a negative into a positive and using it to fuel my activism work. But for some ex-witnesses, it's not that simple. Some have so much anger that they, for example, will find Jehovah's Witnesses preaching on a street corner and confront them, and berate them and mock them. Or they might even storm into a kingdom hall and interrupt a meeting, and try and interfere with what the witnesses are doing that way, and which, in my view, is not a productive way of dealing with one's anger, because apart from anything else, what's happened is that you've just completely verified the stereotype of what an apostate does and how they behave.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So there's all sorts of issues. You could write and probably issues that are best dealt with by people who have more of a reading on psychology than I have, although I have written a book called How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, which kind of goes through some of the basic steps, because apart from the whole psychological angle, and I just have a chapter saying, find a therapist, find a counselor, but there are other kind of fairly basic things, such as starting up regaining your social identity and that kind of thing, and some kind of very practical things, such as how to deal with elders when they knock on your door and want to know why you've not been to a meeting in a few weeks. So
right.
there's just a minefield of things for people to negotiate when they go through this process.
I had a young woman on my podcast over a year ago, probably going on 2 years ago, a young woman named Brooke, and she was a Christian in the Quiverful cult.
Yes.
The Quiverful cult. Quiverful cult. Gosh, that's hard to say, thankfully. And she was so entrenched as a child and as a young person in that movement that when she got out of it finally, she tells this amazing thing in the podcast about how she would she had a terrible time learning how to evaluate someone's character. So she would start dating people, and which she was never allowed to really do until she was supposed to save herself perfectly until she's married and all the rest. And she would start dating men that were really bad to her, and then she would do it again and again and again. And this was more than just the typical pattern that you sometimes hear about of people not valuing themselves or something, and then they tend to get into these patterns. This was more for her of not knowing whether she could trust someone or not, and just sort of indiscriminately trusting people, and then realizing, wait, this person's not trustworthy. How can I tell the difference? Like, how do I know whether a person should be trusted or not? How do I have skepticism about people and evaluate their intentions through the things they say or do? She had to learn all of those social skills that ideally we learn growing up just naturally from the interactions that we have in our families or at school or whatever. She had been isolated from all of those opportunities to learn in those ways. And she got herself into some really difficult situations just trying to navigate as an adult what someone would typically begin to learn when they were 7, 8 years old. It was just fascinating. And it felt to me, and listening to you now, it feels to me like a lifetime of being gaslighted, that you have almost literally gone crazy trying to, figure out how to take responsibility for your own life and not take on, these things that you've been told you're guilty of, or the bad things that are supposedly going to happen to you, and to be able to say, no, I'm my own person. I'm my own, and I can trust my intuition. I mean, I was trained in my upbringing not to trust my feelings or not to trust my intuitions, because that was where the devil would come into my mind and lead me astray. That my own reasoning couldn't be trusted, that it was the divine inspiration that was the only thing that I could trust. And it's still hard for me when I feel like I think I'm right about something, and it's hard for me to even sort of feel strong in that sometimes, like maybe I'm wrong, and which is, not always a bad thing to have some humility about your beliefs or what you're thinking, but it became a kind of pathological self-doubt.
Sure. Because you were so used to having your thinking done for you.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you call it gaslighting, and of course it is. But at least in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, when they're calling apostates mentally diseased,
right?
The tragic thing is that in some ways they're right, because ex-witnesses are so messed up by what's happened to them in the organization. Who can blame them for being in this state? And it's Watchtower who's calling them mentally diseased, who's put them in this position to begin with. That's the real tragedy as far as I'm concerned. And it's what's especially bad is when you have people who you have a policy whereby those who leave are automatically shunned by their believing family. So in my own case, my two daughters, granted one's only 2 weeks old, but let's take Jessica, who's 4 years old. She's never met her granddad. And her granddad's a Jehovah's Witness elder, by the way.
Oh.
He's had opportunities to see her, won't see her. Why? Because mummy and daddy are apostates. And,
wow.
I like to think that I've got more or less a handle on how I feel and the emotional impact that my religion has had on me. But even I struggle sometimes with just waves of sheer frustration that I am being penalized for nothing more than reversing a decision that I was manipulated into making at the age of 11, which is when I was baptized. So because I allowed myself to get baptized as an 11-year-old, my 4-year-old daughter can't have a contact with her granddad. And this sort of thing messes with people so much that you hear time and time again of people committing suicide because of it. Because as humans, we're just not built to deal with ostracism. It's kind of the worst thing that can happen,
right,
to a human being, is for people who they care about to, for some unknown or unjustifiable reason, to just stop talking to them. It messes with people's heads. And because I've now been out of the religion for a while now, you make friends with people from all over the world who, you see them on Facebook, and the thing that you all have in common is that you were all once Jehovah's Witnesses. And I've had a number of occasions now where, this person's actually committed suicide because they just can't deal with it anymore. Even though they know that they were lied to, they know it's not the truth, they know they were exploited. It's just the simple fact that they don't know how to exist with the shunning that they're being subjected to.
I assume that you do, but do you consider the Jehovah's Witnesses a special, like categorically different than Christianity in the sense of the abuse that it does to people?
There's lots of people lots of ex-witnesses, mostly who have converted to another form of Christianity,
right,
who say that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't Christian. I actually disagree with that, because according to the dictionary definition of what a Christian is, which is someone who follows Jesus, Jehovah's Witnesses are Christian. But if you're asking me whether I think they're a cult, then quite clearly they are. Although, again, I have a slightly different take on what a cult is or isn't than most people, because I actually think that any movement that teaches things that are not true to children is doing harm. And I struggle to think of a single religion where that's not the case, because you could have the most benign religion that teaches only doing nice things to people, but if it's filling children's minds with quote unquote facts about the universe that aren't actually true, then it's doing them a disservice. So, but I think that it's scalable. So in my mind, you have kind of soft cults that do almost no damage, and then you have extreme cults that just ruin people's lives. And I place Jehovah's Witnesses fairly high up on that scale.
as a Seventh-day Adventist, we always had to fight off accusations of being a cult from the mainstream evangelicals, and we were constantly, not compared so much, but miscategorized as either Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. People would hear, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, or and they're like, oh, is that that's basically like, that's a Jehovah's Witness? And I'm like, no, it's a Seventh-day Adventist. And they, the three religions have a common history in terms of sort of a rising in the United States in the middle 1900s, the middle 1800s, and it's interesting.
There is actually a bit of a closer link between Adventism and Jehovah's Witnesses than, say, with the Mormons.
That's
because Charles Taze Russell, who founded the Watchtower movement, was heavily influenced by Adventists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, it's interesting. These three have so much in common, from, prophetic utterances to, extreme versions of remnant theology. I mean, every Abrahamic faith has some kind of remnant theology as a part of it, but some of the more progressive ones have sort of opened the remnant to most people, and then universalists have said the remnant is everyone, but some of these more culty type sects of Christianity have held on pretty tightly to the idea of a remnant, a true faithful that will be saved. And if you're not part of that, as you alluded to much earlier in our conversation, that the Jehovah's Witnesses had a special access to God's blessing and salvation. And we would have said the same thing as Seventh-day Adventists, and I believe Mormons as well. So this we can sort of bring our conversation towards a conclusion by just talking briefly about this story that broke in the Atlantic Monthly a few weeks ago about a database that's been compiled by the Jehovah's Witness leadership of individuals in the church, leaders of the church who have been guilty of sexual assault and sexual harassment. This is obviously something that you've started talking about 7 years ago. Why is the story coming out now?
It's coming out because we've been talking about it for years and still no one's doing anything about it. You would think if let's say a government organization, or let's say, I don't know, a political candidate had on his computer records of tens of thousands of alleged perpetrators of child sex abuse that he wasn't handing over to the authorities, that would be a massive, massive scandal. But if you're a religion, apparently that's the sort of thing you're allowed to do and get away with without too many questions asked. I honestly think we're living at the wrong point in history, because I'm pretty sure that future generations won't tolerate that sort of thing. But we're living at a point in history where an organization, as long as it can get away with calling itself a religion, has carte blanche to do that sort of thing. So we knew about this database as far back as 2002. There was a BBC Panorama documentary called Suffer the Little Children that interviewed a former elder who said it was 23,000 names on the list.
Wow.
And since then, we've had more clarification on how the database is stored. It was, for at least a period, stored on a SharePoint system. In Australia, they managed to get a chunk of it, namely all of the records from Australia going back to 1950. This was in 2014. So we're talking, many decades of records. And they found that over that period, just in Australia, there'd been 1,006 alleged perpetrators of abuse, accumulating 1,800 victims, and not a single one of them had been reported to the police.
And the purpose for the database internally to the church was what?
Oh, because first of all, we can't have Jehovah's name coming into reproach. So We'll keep our own records on that sort of thing, thank you. No need to bother the authorities about this. But mostly because they have Well, they hold to the idea that for anything like that, the church's kind of disciplinary process is paramount. So they have what's called the two-witness rule based on Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. You know, you can't convict someone unless there's two witnesses to the accusation. They interpret that for all instances of quote-unquote sin, but they include child sex abuse in that, even though, as we know, people who abuse children sexually aren't usually in the habit of getting someone to witness it for them. So,
right. Oof.
There's some very backward thinking going on there.
So was the purpose of the database then to remove leaders and quietly set them aside, or were they doing what the Catholics were doing and probably still are doing in moving them around from place to place to keep the thing from blowing up?
They do. It's not really like the Catholic thing. The Catholic thing is, as far as I can tell, more to do with the way accusations against priests are dealt with, and the way that the Catholic Church has typically dealt with a priest who, you know, let's remember, due to his position, has almost unbridled access to the members of the congregation, including children, and unquestioned respect.
Right.
Due to his position. And so the response of the Catholic Church is to just move the priest to a different parish. With Jehovah's Witnesses, it's in a way more sinister than that. We're not talking about priests or elders per se. We're talking about anyone who is accused of child sex abuse. So it could be just an ordinary rank and file member of the congregation. If, let's say, his daughter goes to the elders and say, Daddy's been abusing me, and Daddy denies it, and there are no other witnesses, the policy is that they will leave it in Jehovah's hands. It used to be that they would even make it almost impossible for the victim to alert the authorities without themselves being punished for slander. But now they've relaxed that rule, but they still don't have a policy where they will, in all cases, alert the authorities in that situation. The best they've come up with now is, we wouldn't tell a victim that they can't go to the police. So, in other words, they put everything in the victim's lap. They don't accept any responsibility for alerting authorities when they find out about a sexual predator in the congregation.
So that name would go on the database.
Indeed.
Even though it wasn't confirmed by a second witness, the name would still go on the database as sort of a record, so that if someone else came forward, then that would satisfy the second witness. And then
Indeed. But the database isn't just for that. It's not just for, such and such a body accused such and such a body of this, and we couldn't reach a decision. The database will also include instances where there's been a confession. So you could have, according to the current policy, and we've had examples of this, you could have a Jehovah's Witness who confesses to sexually abusing a child, but because they say they're sorry, they're deemed repentant, and therefore they're not excommunicated from the congregation. They're quote-unquote reproved, which means basically that they just aren't allowed to comment at the meetings for a few months, and then they're back to normal.
Restored, yeah.
Which means that their victim, let's say the victim's in their congregation, their victim has to see them week in, week out, and treat them as though this person is their brother.
So here, at least in the United States, clergy, I think it's just clergy, not lay church leaders, are mandatory reporters. So I guess my question is, with the, I guess we're looking at almost 20 years, like 15 plus years of reporting on this crisis in the Jehovah's Witness community, and then most recently an article in the Atlantic Monthly. Do you see any consequences coming from this? Are people going to face trials? Are they going to be arrested or charged with either endangering the lives of children or failing to report when their status required them to?
Well, the problem you have in America, actually in the United Kingdom, there isn't any mandatory reporting. You would think there should be, but they're not at that point yet. In America, it really depends on the state. But even in states where there is mandatory reporting, Watchtower has been caught not reporting, even though it was the law, and that happened in Montana. I think that's mentioned in the Atlantic article, where
Right.
Watchtower was fined $35 million for refusing to notify authorities of a predator in the congregation. In fact, they knew about this man. They knew this man had molested another child, and they didn't alert the authorities. And guess what? He went on and molested someone else.
How surprising.
They just sat on it. They hadn't done anything about it. So that's what's happening. But if you're asking me what ought to happen, is that all 8 members of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses need to be arrested, and they need to be prosecuted for the cover-up of child sex abuse, and they need to serve time in jail proportionate to how long they've been in office. But we're nowhere near that happening, because for whatever reason, you'll have to ask the United States authorities and the FBI or whatever. They just don't seem interested in holding religions accountable for the cover-up of child sex abuse.
And it seems in other cases and across the United States with other faiths, other Christian faiths mostly, that the religious exemptions that you're speaking of, this is sort of an informal religious exemption, but there are formal religious exemptions which allow, churches to discriminate on the basis of people's identity and so forth. It seems like religion is often, like you said, carte blanche to discriminate, to abuse without consequences, with impunity. We just saw in the Catholic Church finally a cardinal in the Catholic Church being arrested and facing charges and probably looking at some jail time, which may be the rest of his life because he's quite old. I just wonder whether any of the domestic cases here in the United States, whether it be the Jehovah's Witnesses that we're talking about right now, or the stories that have come out recently about the Baptists in the Houston Chronicle a month or two ago, whether leadership in these organizations will face any consequences for what they've either done or covered up.
Well, they should have faced consequences years ago, but unfortunately, again, we're living at the wrong point in history. There's still way too much deference being shown to the institution of religion, but there is hope, because at least the media is starting to talk about it. And in Douglas Quinqua's Atlantic article, we see a very, very thorough expose, very well-written expose with some very compelling stories, just laying everything out, on a plate, so that when the authorities are finally of a mind to hold people who cover up child sex abuse on an industrial scale to account, the information's all there for them.
Finally, just do you think there's something about the theology of either Christianity in general or the Witnesses particularly that leads to the tendency to engage in sexual assault of minors or not of minors? Or is it just the combination of power and silence and secrecy? Or is there something theological that you think is making this a common case among other religions as well?
I know that in Jehovah's Witnesses, it's almost the theology and the culture makes it almost a perfect storm for this to happen. I mean, I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't figure it out while I was still in there. But they have like this thing where you're not allowed to take another brother to court. You need to be prepared to forgive, even in the most extreme cases. You need to trust the elders in all matters. You need to let them administer the affairs of the congregation, including wrongdoing. There's the 2-witness rule, which I've already gone into. And you stack all these things up together and stand back and think, gosh, that's a pedophile's paradise right there. But those are all of the ingredients. If you were a pedophile, you'd be falling over yourself to join a religion like that. But I think more broadly, in terms of Christianity, I think there is a lot of sexual repression intrinsic in many manifestations of Christianity, including Catholicism. I mean, look at, the way the clergy must be celibate, for example.
Right.
I think that when you dabble with people's sexuality, you're playing with fire. And lots of iterations of Christianity are guilty of this. So it's perhaps not a surprise that there is such rampant pedophilia in so many Christian denominations.
Yeah, boy, it is just nauseating to think about whether you have children of your own, as you and I both do, or whether you don't. It's just, we all know people who are children, and it's bad enough that men in particular in power will abuse women specifically in most cases when they're not children, but then to go that next level, which is, I think, really incomprehensible for most of us, how a person could prey on a child who's not even really fully developed in their minds and in their bodies to even be able to comprehend what's happening to them, and the trauma that their body absorbs and their mind absorbs that will affect them for the rest of their life. It's truly pernicious and evil.
It's the worst thing that could happen to a child, apart from obviously killing them.
Right.
Because it stays with them for the rest of their lives. And, any institution, whether it's religious or not, the absolute minimum requirement is that it looks after the most vulnerable in its community. And at least in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, that is a requirement that it is failing time and time again. Well
said. Well, Lloyd, thank you so much for, number one, just thank you for everything that you've done over the last many years and are continuing to do. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time out of your evening and spending it with us here. And I really hope and look forward to future interactions that we may have and ways that we might collaborate to help liberate people from these cults that are really harming them and continue to hold people's feet to the fire until maybe, as you say, one day our society will take this sort of thing seriously.
Indeed. Listen, I really admire what you're doing, Ryan. I think that a lot of people will be able to relate. A lot of people will be empowered by, some of the discussions that you're having, and I'm just very honored to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you appreciated Lloyd's story and the conversation that we shared. If you have a thought about today's episode, a comment, a suggestion, a clarification, or even a correction, please email me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org. The links to the articles that we talked about are in the show notes, as well as a link to buy Lloyd's book, The Reluctant Apostate. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel and share it with anyone you know who needs to escape from this dangerous cult. I'm really excited about the next couple of episodes that are coming up on the show. I'm not sure which order these will appear in, but in the next few weeks, you'll hear from James Croft, who is the outreach director for the Society for Ethical Culture in St. Louis, Missouri. In the next few days, I'll be recording an interview with Yale professor Martin Hageland about his new book, This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. It's a groundbreaking new book that looks at the fragility and temporality of human life and contemporary politics. I can't wait to both have this conversation with Professor Hageland and also to share it with you. Also, in the next few weeks, I'll be hosting our second live hangout for members on the subject of loss, grief, and mourning, with a panel of experts on the subject that include Brian Peck, Garrett Price, my guest from the previous episode, and Rachel Roth, who is in private practice helping people with exactly those issues and concerns. So if you want to be a part of that live hangout and contribute to that conversation, please join Life After God as a member today. You can do that at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. For more information about Life After God and to stay in touch with everything else that we're doing, please visit lifeaftergod.org. Until next time, my name is Ryan Bell, and this has been the Life After God podcast.